Good morning and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture CropTalk webinar. If you have any questions during these presentations this morning, please type them into the Q&A icon on your Zoom toolbar and we'll get to them at the end of each presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you. Go ahead, Amir.
Thanks, Laurie. This is me, Amir Farouk from Manitoba Agriculture. So I am just covering Lionel Cashew today. So as harvest progressing and a lot of other crops are getting harvest, so the soybeans is also coming to near harvest. So we thought that this is a good time to talk about soybean and edible bean crops. So we invited today our pulse specialist Dennis Lang to talk about the soybean and edible bean and to prepare for the harvest and if anything else to talk about these crops. So I welcome Dennis and Dennis, please go ahead.
Good morning, all. I'm going to just share my screen and we're going to get into it here in a second. And we're going to share and we're going to go into full screen mode as soon as I get rid of this little icon. Now, you should be seeing my first slide there, Amir, that's the start off slide. Is that correct?
Yep, it looks great, Dennis.
Perfect. Okay, let's roll into this here today. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at a few things about soybeans and a few things about dry beans, actually, just to tell you what's been happening kind of this year a little bit and some of the things to kind of keep in mind. Just starting off here, how many soybean acres did we actually get planted this year? We're looking at just over 1.2 million acres. That was a little surprising. I thought it might be a little bit higher. I think initial reports were going to be somewhere around 1.5 million acres. What is a surprise when you look down this list here? There's one variety here that was at the top of the list for quite a number of years, the S007-Y4. And that was at the top of the list. Last year it was number 2, just shy of the number 1 variety, the P006-837. But you can see here now there's more of the extend beans in that top 5 list here now. I think part of that could be just from all the discussions about water hemp and other weed resistance that we've been dealing with. The other thing that's a bit of a surprise when you look at this here is the number 2 variety is actually a longer season variety. It's the PS007A2XS, which is a little bit longer season, but it is a bit of a surprise to see the changes in those lines here. But every year we always have a few standard lines, but overall, this is what we're looking at here for soybean acres this past year. What about dry bean acres? Well, again, there was lots of discussion all through the winter time about how many dry bean acres we were going to have planted. And initial reports were going to be somewhere around 200,000 acres. As spring progressed, growers made a few changes here and there, and we ended up with about almost 172,000 acres. The big surprises, pintos, 111,000. That's the most I believe we've ever planted in Manitoba. We were looking back to in some of the older slides to 2002, and that year I think we were right around 90,000 acres. And but we also had 130,000 acres of navies, which when you look at this list here, the navies are actually only around 11,000 acres. So that's really changed over the last number of years. Blacks are the other main type that we grow here. That there was a bit of an increase there as well. We were just under 30, right around 30,000 last year, and we're about 48,000 this year. When you look at these varieties and the different within the different classes, Vibrant makes up the most of the dry beans that we grow in Manitoba, almost 50%. That is the slow darkening pinto. We have Windbreaker coming in at second at 27%. So they make up the lion's share of the pinto acres. When you look at blacks, interesting blacks, the CDC Blackstrap and CDC Eclipse are almost very, very close. They're only 0.2% off. That tells me there's maybe a few more blacks in the southwestern and part of the province. Eclipse is a bit longer season variety, not as suited for those regions. But you can see here, those make up the top 2. And of course, with navy beans here, T9905, still number 1, almost 72% of the acres. There are a few other classes that make up these as well, such as the other coloreds, kidneys, and crayons. Those acres help make up that total 171,000 for this year. So some of the concerns I'm going to mention here right off the hop for dry beans. Soybeans and dry beans don't go together. This is a sample from a grower from a few years ago where they actually had volunteer soybeans come up in their dry beans because they had planted soybeans 2 years prior and only had 1 year between planting the dry beans and the soybeans, and they had some volunteer issues. This is also a bit of a concern as well if you're in an area that you're trying to make a decision whether to harvest your soybeans first or your dry beans first. I would suggest putting your dry beans through first, get those off, because it's really difficult to clean up the combine from those odd soybeans. And the reason it's such a concern is it is a food allergen. Soybeans are a food allergen in the dry bean industry, so buyers don't like it. And in some instances, even as much as 0.5% soybeans, the buyers might end up rejecting that load. So again, keep those things in mind, you know, when you're transferring equipment or using different pieces of equipment like belt conveyors, make sure that, you know, you didn't use soybeans before you start using it on their dry beans because you don't want that contamination risk. Same idea here. This can happen, you know, this is from an instance where a grower was growing both blacks and pintos, didn't think they needed to clean out in between, and this is what they have. Now, color shorters do separate some of this. The only problem is with the color shorter, if you notice here in the, I'm just going to use my pointer here. You notice that these solid color pintos are called sports. The color shorter typically will try to separate the blacks out, but there's no guarantee they're going to get all of them. And plus you lose some of the good beans, which is the called the sports. So that's why it's really, really important to be aware of what's going on with that. So this is a slide I like to put up every once in a while. This kind of just gives us a reminder of what happens on a wet year. There were some fields this year that did experience some heavy moisture in spring on dry beans. And this is from a few years back, but you can see here the soybeans in the foreground here. It came through those 5 inches of rain pretty good, where the dry beans, in this case, happen to be navy beans, did not fare so well last year. So there's reasons why, you know, we prefer to see dry beans on lighter soils and fields that are very well drained. One of the big challenges this year was wind in spring, both in dry beans and soybeans. I fielded a number of calls this year where, you know, some of these soybean and dry bean fields got hammered multiple times with heavy wind, with strong winds, and really beat up those plants. Now, the soybean seems to come through it eventually, but you can see here how damaged that growing point, that main growing point is. And the leaves really got beat up. So it did set them back a little bit. And there was some replanting done on some soybean fields this year just because of how windy it was in spring on some of that lighter soil. Now, both of these crops can regrow. You can see here, this is a damaged plant, and you can see here about a week afterwards, you're starting to see some regrowth. The only problem with the regrowth is if it's coming too late in the season. For example, if it's already June 15th and you've had a big windstorm go on, hit the crops hard on the 13th, you might not have options for replanting at that stage. So you really have to do a good stand assessment to make sure that you know what stand you have left. I think that's really important in both soybeans and dry beans. At the end, you want to know what your target population was. So if you're in soybeans, for example, targeting 200,000 seeds per acre planted, if you end up with 100,000, then you know something's going on. There's something wrong there. You should be between 140 and 160. That's the ideal target population that you want to shoot for. For dry beans, kind of the same idea, but sometimes those growers tend to, when you're for navy beans, for example, you're shooting for about 100,000 seeds per acre in a 30-inch row. And if you end up with 85 or 90,000 emerging, that's great. But if that wind picks up and beats up those plants, sometimes you can get down to a much lower level in that 30 to 40,000, and that's too low. So those are the kind of things you have to kind of keep in mind, something that we learned this year. The reason I bring this up is there's always discussions about rolling soybeans and dry beans and when's the ideal time to roll. Now, ideally, after seeding, when the ground should be dry, that's when I like to see growers rolling soybeans and dry beans as well, if conditions are suited. They're rolling for stones, dirt lumps, corn stalks, generally just to reduce the earth tag on the pulses. If, however, it's a dry spring and you're concerned about conserving moisture and you're concerned about the wind damage, what I would suggest is not rolling after seeding. I would wait until those beans are up, and that would be for both soybeans and dry beans, until at least that first trifoliate stage. At this stage, you can roll those plants and they will recover. There's a couple points I want to make on this though, is that when you're rolling soybeans, when they're out of the ground, you want to be rolling in the afternoon. No no rolling in the morning. Even if it might be a warm morning, but you need at least 25 degrees, get those plants nice and pliable so that when the roller goes over top of them, they just kind of bounce back. You don't want to break any plants. So again, sometimes it can be a little tricky, but keep in mind, first try foliage is what we target. If the plants are all up and they're still at unifoliate stage, then I would say go ahead. You can still roll then, but make sure you do it on the warm day. Even pushing in into second trifoliate will work as well. So that gives you probably about anywhere from 10 to 20 days as far as your window of rolling. The one thing you don't want to roll is if the beans are just poking through the surface and the hypocotyl is exposed. If that hypocotyl is exposed, then you can snap those plants. So, but always a good to kind of start off if you're going to be doing any post harvest or post seeding. Try that again. Any rolling post seeding and post emergence. What you want to do is you want to do a stand establishment first. So take the hula hoop and do some counts before you pull into the field. And then after you make your pass, check how many plants are being lost. If you're only losing, 2 or 3%, then you're good to go. If you're losing 20%, well, that's a different story. So keep those things in mind. Another issue that is always on our mind every year is IDC and soybeans. We run a variety trial specifically for IDC. It's located close to Winnipeg. You can see here these individual rows are all individual varieties. We test each of these varieties 3 times, so it's 3 replications, and I rate each of these plots over a 3-week period, once a week. So in the end, I come up with a total of 9 ratings. You can see here in this picture on the right here, this plant here, this row here is highly susceptible to iron deficiency chlorosis. This site is known for high carbonates and high salts. And the variety beside, that's more like a 2. You see some yellowing in there, but you can see how much larger the plants are. And the reason I bring this up now is we're getting into harvest now. And one of the things you should note when you're in the combine is note to see if you're seeing any of these short plants at this stage of the game. And that's usually kind of remnants of the IDC that you've seen earlier in the season. If a variety is very, very short and doesn't yield as well as you thought it should have, and you can't figure out any other reason why, make sure you do a soil test on that field to determine what your carbonates and salts are. On that, you can soil test, you can ask for your carbonates and salts. On this particular soil test here, you see your carbonates are 5.9%, which is quite high. The soluble salts at 0.87 micromoles per centimeter, which is also very high. When you go to the soybean fertility fact sheet that MPSG puts out, there's a little chart here that you can use to compare, where your levels are at. So we said here we were at over 5% and we were close to 1. So that means our risk is very high for IDC. And what I'd like to do there is then go back to the guide, see what the seed guide, look up your variety and see what your rating is, and just determine whether or not maybe next time that field comes back into soybeans, that maybe you should switch into a different variety. I've had it happen before where growers called me and they were very not happy with the variety that they had that they had that year. It was short, it was stunted, didn't produce much yield. We started walking through a few things and we discovered that the variety that the grower happened to choose was a susceptible variety. Now, a susceptible variety will do well if the salts and carbonates are low. So if you're kind of in this range here. However, if the salts and carbonates are high, then that's not the correct variety to be planting on that field. So that's what we can take out of this. We're going to roll up a slide here. And I think I went just a little bit too far here. Go back a slide here. It was a little sensitive on the clicking here. There we go. Alrighty. So the big thing that people are concerned with right now is frost in soybeans. I'll run you through a few of the stages here. If you're at the R6 stage, which is full seed, that is where the seed fills that entire cavity on one of the 4 uppermost nodes on the main stem. If you're at the R5 stage, which is the earlier stage, then you're at seed at 1/8 of an inch long. So it's a lot smaller seed. The reason I mention that is because now a lot of the beans are approaching into R7, which does reduce the risk of frost dramatically when you get into that R7 stage. If you had plants that were in that previous stage and they froze, what can happen is you will see that frost at the R5 stage reduces your yield anywhere from 50 to 70%. Frost at the R6 stage, you're only looking at 20 to 30%. And frost at the R7 stage is a 5% yield loss can be expected. And when a plant is considered full maturity, or R8, that's 95% brown pod, there's no leaf left on it. The plants, when you shake the plants, the seeds inside rattle, so that seeds had separated out from the hilum. So that's what we're shooting for for the crop to finish off. Now, this is a scenario where they probably got a bit of frost here in the R6 stage. Late R6, you can see how much green there was in there. We really haven't had over the years any major issues with frost. Going back to the year 2012, that was the first year that I started here. Actually, 2011 actually is that year we had some varieties that had a bit of green in it. There were some longer season varieties. Before that, the only major frost event that we've had on hail or on soybeans was back in 2004, but that was an August frost, so that's quite different. So where are the stages at right now? Well, took a drive out to Morris yesterday, came along this first field here, and not quite reaching R7, we're still got a little ways to go yet. But keep in mind, we've had 30 degrees this week, so these beans have really moved. The field right beside it, totally different scenario. I'm not sure on the varieties, but my best guess, based on where it's located, these are two different varieties. This would be a shorter season or early to mid-season variety. The previous picture would be a longer season variety, probably like a 007 or 008. And you can see here it's starting to turn, but this heat that we're having now, this 30-degree temperatures, have really moved things along. And here that you can see them side by side. So that was quite interesting to see. You know, you don't generally see that in that Morris area where you have that dramatic of a difference fields side by side, mainly because they generally get planted about the same time and the varieties are typically fairly similar. But this was an interesting development here. Lionel sent me some pictures here on the weekend, some fields that he was at here. Here you can see that the crop is definitely still sitting at R6 yet, but the leaves are turning. Full seeds in the top 4 nodes. And you can see that here. So that by now, I'm sure that's going to change a lot. It has really moved. So this is more September 10th. And these are this is the field that's surrounding the plots. You can see here, pretty much all at R8 stage here. They're pretty much safe. There's the odd green leaf in here yet, but generally those plants are pretty much safe from any kind of frost whatsoever. How fast can these things move? Well, when we look at one of the plots that we have at the Morris site, this was on September the 6th. You can see here, this particular variety here was probably about 10% brown pod. There's still some green plant material, lots of leaves in here. And you come back just a few days later here, 4 days later, this was yesterday, you can see how they really changed. So this would be considered 95% brown pod. And with 95% brown pod, that doesn't mean it's ready to harvest. That means you're probably about 10 to 14 days around to harvest. Your moisture is probably sitting around 30 to 32%. So you still got a few days there. But these crops with this heat that we're having really have moved along. And this might be probably one of the shortest maturity rating seasons we're going to have. Sometimes these things drag on for a couple of weeks. And this year it's not doing that. So with our 8 pod stage, you can see here the pods are brown. When you look inside, the seed is pretty much detached. Moisture is still fairly high because the seeds are pretty puffy yet. So overall, I think we're doing all right maturity-wise. But again, what's really helped is this week of warm, hot temperatures. The question was asked, by a colleague here, what happens? We're getting some cooler weather right now. We're dropping down to 2 degrees. What kind of frost can these beans take? Well, basically, when you look at that, if you're at the R8 stage, you're safe. At 0 degrees, if there's still some green plant material, it's just going to freeze off the top of the leaves. If you're at, R5, which I don't think there won't be much of that in the valley here, Red River Valley here, might be maybe a bit further north up in the Swan area, but generally a little frost at -1 probably won't do much damage at that stage. And with the forecasts that we have moving forward with this, it should be okay for the most part. So I'm going to mention this one particular disease. We did find some Phytophthora root rot again this year. We always seem to find a little bit every year, a bit more this year in some areas. And you can see here these plants, how they've darkened here from the root up. The leaves are wilty, droopy. You got that shepherd's crook here at the top. Keep an eye open for Phytophthora root rot when you're harvesting any pockets in there, make note of that. And then if you're seeing large areas of that, may want to look at a different variety for next year, something that might have some different resistant genes that you can work with. Harvest management and dry beans. This is not something you want to see in the back of the combine or in the back of the truck box. Now, in this particular scenario, what's happened here is there's been some green plant material coming into the combine. Either the grower elected not to desiccate, or the plants weren't quite ready yet to harvest, and you had some soil being picked up. Now, this sample actually wasn't in the hopper. This sample was actually in the back of the truck. So if you find that you're getting soil sticking to the seed or smearing the seed on the back of the truck, more than likely the culprit is going to be your unloading auger. It's got to build up somewhere. So I always recommend to growers, when you're harvesting your beans, what you need to do is you need to check the sample, make sure it's clean, make sure you're not picking up anything in there for weeds, and then also check how it looks in the back of the grain truck as well, just to make sure that you're not smearing into those beans. Sometimes even the soft immature beans can cause that to happen. Now, if you don't pick up soil, with the combine, that's a bonus as well. Now, with some growers, what they've done to the experienced edible growers, they'll put a screen under the feeder house to help remove some of that soil coming in before it gets into the combine. Probably the best recommendation I can give you if you're into dry bean production is have one of these slotted screens installed under your feeder house. That will allow you to keep that soil from coming into the combine. Proper adjustment of the combine. Using wide wire concaves is really important because you want to make sure that those beans are dropping through. You want to run your cylinder speed slow as well, in that 300 to 400 range, just to keep it running slow. Now, a lot of growers are using flex headers to flex off their beans. This particular image does not have an air bar on it, but that is something that I would tend to recommend to growers trying to flex off beans, is using an air bar along with their flex header, just because that way it keeps the knife clean, keeps stuff from building up, and you gain more beans that way. I'm going to finish off here just with a reminder about water hemp. Water hemp has been found in more locations this year. This is a map from last year, from 2023. They had 20 confirmed RMs up to that point that had water hemp. Watch for those weird looking pigweed plants at this time of the year, especially in soybeans. Keep those things in mind. Don't put them through the combine. Really important. Make sure you pull them out. Pictures from summertime. You can see here the leaf shape is different than a pigweed. The stem color can be different as well, but you always want to feel that stem. Is that stem nice and smooth? And generally in soybeans right now, what you'll probably see is you'll see these weird looking plants that are sticking up above the canopy. Those are the ones you want to go in there and pull. Do not put them through the combine. Pull them up, dig out the roots, bag them up, remove them from the field. If you can do that on those first few plants that you see, then you won't need to, it'll help reduce those the seed spread, because you put that through the combine, you're going to end up with a lot of seed going all over the place. Some final notes, just how to deal with water hemp throughout the season. Scout after each herbicide application for any escapes. Watch your soybean fields as crop matures, like we're doing now. Identify, remove, and destroy weeds in the field, like pull them up. If you do decide to mow areas, you keep in mind they can regrow. So you want to make, and they can regrow fairly fast and still produce seed. Using multiple modes of action to control during the growing season, another good way to do it. Pre-emergent products, residual control products, really important. And I think now I'd mentioned earlier we're seeing more dicamba in the system here now. That dicamba and enlist system, and use those on your first pass with the glyphosate. If you're in an area that has water hemp, you want to get those weeds under control early, so there's competition. So there's no competition for the soybeans, because once soybeans get going and there's no bare ground, it makes it much more difficult for those weeds to come through, because water hemp likes those warm crops. So with that, or those warm soils, warm bare ground. So with that being said, I'll open it up for any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dennis. Lori, do you have any question on the?
I don't have any that came up. I think you have a couple, but I didn't see any come up during the presentation. No.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. So what is the best grain moisture to start harvesting?
Well, when we're looking at soybeans, typically if you're putting them into aeration, growers like to be in that 14 to 15% range. 14 is considered dry, but some growers will start at 15%, but they'll drop pretty fast. And once you get in there, just make sure there's not too many green puffy ones in there. Generally, they will, especially in this heat here, things will move pretty quick. But 14% and lower for soybeans. For dry beans, typically, depending on your buyer, some buyers will take it at 17 or 18% moisture. Some buyers like it under 16% moisture. Ideally, I think once you go in there, it's really important to check your moisture, but just make sure you're doing a good job harvesting, not creating splits in dry beans, especially. Soybeans, it's not as critical, mainly because that's going into more of a crush market. Unless you're going into a food grade market, well, then there's some there you want to keep your splits a lot lower. So
Okay, so I just got a question from a farmer. So he is actually the first time grower for the dry beans. So he just sent the question that we are first time black bean growers and trying to combine with conventional combines. So we have got slow down kits on the cylinder, engine running around 1700 RPM, took half the wires out of the concaves. We have tried when it's damp, when it's dry, and are splitting way too many. So do you know anyone that's combined them with conventional? Do you have any
yeah,
other ideas?
yeah, and there's a few starting points I like to start with here, and I'm just putting the slide up here of the concaves. So whether it's a conventional or rotary, if you're pulling every other wire in a conventional, that's going to help, especially those first few wires. A few things to kind of keep in mind. What I like to do is I run the engine speed at full throttle, but slow your RPMs down, your cylinder RPMs to in that 300 to 400 RPM range. Start with your soybean setting. So the concave is open, but if the plants are dry, and this is one important task for a new thing to remember for a new grower, is that if your black beans have green plant material, or the straw isn't totally dry, what ends up happening is it actually is more difficult to thrash the beans out of the pod. You're better off thrashing on a hot day like we've had in the last few days, and mid-afternoon. Keep your cylinder speed low, concave spacing like soybeans, and keep your combing running full. That makes a big difference. And check your splits. If you're finding that you're still having a lot of splits, this may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but actually close up your concave. Tighten it up a little bit until your splits are reduced. The reason for that is because as the rotor hits those beans and they fall through the concave quicker, then there's they don't get damaged. But if your concave is too wide open, sometimes what happens is the beans pass through further in the concave, and they can get beat up more by the rotor. So slow cylinder speed, concave spacing, kind of like soybeans. So you want it you want it open to some degree. You don't want to have it like wheat, or you don't want to have it like wheat. Probably a bit more open than what you have for oats, but just keep an eye on that. If the seeds itself and the plants are dry, they'll thrash out pretty easy. If the pods are green or they're spitting out the back, then maybe it's time just to hang on for a bit and let those plants dry off a little bit more. So that's my tips for that. So
Okay, thank you, Dennis.
thank you.
Is there any question, Lori, on the online? anything?
Nope, I don't have anything, Amir.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis, for
Okay,
the good presentation. And if there will be any other question, we will send you in your email and you can answer later.
thank you. I'm going to
So,
stop sharing my screen now so you can take over,
yeah,
Amir.
thanks a lot. So, can you see my screen, Lori?
Yeah, it looks really good now. Go right ahead.
Okay. So our next slide is just about our harvest progress. So this is the provincial harvest progress. Winter wheat is close to 100% done. Overall in Manitoba is 99%. And fall rye is also at the same thing. And in empty fields like those harvested canola fields, already some producers are planting winter wheat for the next year. And spring wheat is 65% in southwest region, and overall in the northwest region is slower, 40%, and overall it's 68%. And the quality is overall fair to good in most of the region and most of the province. Barley is 76%, oats 73%, and field piece is also close to done, and 98% overall in the province. And the yield is average to above average, and quality is also good. And canola harvest is going a little slower, uh, but it's getting pace with the weather conditions. So most of canola is in the southwest region. We have seen is crop is lodged, and it's little some hurdles in the harvest, but hopefully most of producers are swathing this year, so it's 30% overall complete in the province. And next slide is for the spring wheat quality rating, as it's looks like good, and most of our quality is good to fair in the province. So next our we have a crop scouting panel, and today I have one question which came in online, and this is for our land management specialist for Malna Rickman. So this is about like the time, fall time, most of producers actually planning for the soil sampling. So just we can ask the timing from the specialist that how we can progress for this. So what is the best time to start soil sampling for next year? Does weather play a role? So like what is the best time? So Marla,
Yes,
can you just take on this for this
absolutely,
question?
Amir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah, so quite often, because this is one of those years where you've got kind of an early fall, and people start worrying about whether or not sampling too early is going to be a problem. But we've got the opportunity to get out and start sampling behind the combine. And so sampling behind the combine is not a bad thing. I know that the concern is often going too early means that we'll miss out on some of that nitrogen mineralization time and factor that might increase the nitrate level in the soil sample the later you wait. That being said, there's been a lot of data or some research looking at reviewing the different bits of data. Dave Franson did this a few years back. And what he found was that it's not really going to make a big difference in terms of how much of that nitrogen mineralization will happen. Now, if we've got warmer weather like we're having right now, those mineralization rates can be higher because again, it's a biological process, so it's very dependent on weather, but it's also something that depends on moisture. And so if we have pretty dry soils, that will slow it down again. So it's quite a variable thing in our climate and our region. And so to be able to rely or assume that we're going to have high rates of nitrogen mineralization through the fall, it's a really difficult thing to just rely on simply based on the variability in our weather conditions. So going out and soil sampling behind the combine, again, is not a bad idea. Remember that we always want you to be soil sampling 0 to 6 and 6 to 24 in order to get that nitrate sample and sulfate kind of levels down to depth, because that's a really critical thing to look at. Dennis spoke earlier about things like salts and such. It's good to be able to see those down to that depth as well, because it gives you a good baseline and something to monitor and track from year to year. The weather does also play a role in that, you know, in years past, sometimes we get a little burned by the weather changing later on in the fall, that we can have a nice open looking dry fall and then all of a sudden switch to, you know, the rain that never lets up in October. And so given that, if there's, and I don't know what the long-term forecast is for this or what the guesses are for what our weather is going to be like through the rest of the fall, if there's ever that risk of things getting too wet to go in and sample, it's a good thing to have gotten it done earlier. So while we have the time, not a bad thing to be getting started and getting those soil samples also taken before tillage happens, because then you can get a more accurate 0 to 6 inch depth before that soil has been mixed. And it's harder to kind of hit that 6 inch depth once that soil has been kind of fluffed up and the depth doesn't look quite the same anymore.
Okay, thank you so much. And what is your recommendation for the sampling? We should sample every year, same quarter, or we can just skip 1 year and do next year?
Ideally, I would love for people to soil sample every year, because it does give you an opportunity to track things. And sometimes that soil sampling is also backtracking. Occasionally, say we have a really dry, droughty year, you're going to have a lot of nitrates that are left behind because the crop didn't take up enough nutrient. But then maybe you have a years where you've got ample and lots of nitrate left behind. Maybe we're able to track and kind of backcast having over applied or supplied more nutrient than the crop really required or took up. So being able to take a soil sample annually, ultimately in the long run, looking at cost of production, soil sampling is not an expensive endeavor in terms of the value that you get from that information versus the cost of the fertilizer that goes down based on that information. And if you don't have that number accurate, you know, you could be over or under applying and either lose out financially on paying too much for fertilizer that you didn't require, or losing yield that you could have had if you had fertilized more appropriately. So soil sampling annually would be kind of the ideal scenario, even if it is just at that composite sample. That being said, if you are good at tracking your yields, good at tracking your fertilizer application, you can do a little bit of calculations to look at removal versus application rates to kind of guess where you should be based on how your crop performed and how much nutrient should have then been taken up or removed by that fertilizer that was applied. And so then if you were going in and say soil sampling every second year, as long as you're doing good documentation of what you've been practicing, you may be able to just kind of keep on track and just use that as that check-in to make sure that you are kind of appropriately matching your fertilizer application to what your needs are without always having that annual soil sample. So ideally, soil sampling every year is important, but with good record keeping and good monitoring and calculations, you may be able to get away with soil sampling a little less frequently.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Mala. So, is there any question, Lori, at this point?
Nope, we're clear still.
Okay, so the next slide. So this is kind of our last some slides. So we have this is Manitoba hay listing website. If you have some hay for sale, so please call 1-800 number. So they will put your hay on sale. And if you want to burn something for your crop residue, so please check on this website and check your RMs and the times if you are able to, if you want like for burn or not. So please check or maybe call the number there. And these are our crop production extension specialists in the province: Lionel, Terry, Earl, Callum, me, Nicole, and Veronica. So they are very helpful for your crop production, and if there will be any questions, so they can just connect you with the right person in the department. And next we have our livestock extension specialists, Pam, Elizabeth, Sean, Andrea, Cindy, and Kristen. So they are also located in different parts of the province. So they are also very knowledgeable people in livestock side. So they will help you if you have any question about livestock or forages. These are our MASC service center numbers. Do you have any question about crop insurance or livestock insurance? Please call these numbers. They will help you around. And this is last slide. Please join us for next crop talk at September 18th. And if you have any question, send to Lori or Lionel on these emails. And thank you so much for attending this webinar and have a good day. Thanks.